verified videos posted online by Ukrainian journalists and officials show celebrations in Kherson after Russia retreated from the city.
All right, what we're looking at here is a map of the southern front. Specifically, here is Kherson and Novokakova. Now, everything north of that river, that's the Dnieper River, roughly analogous to the American Mississippi. Everything north of that river was captured by the Ukrainians over the course of the last few days. The two bridges that those arrows are pointing at specifically have been disabled. Spans are down, so proper repairs would take months. There's still the possibility that the Ukrainians could theoretically cross them with pontoons, but that would be going directly into the teeth of the Russians, and then the Ukrainians would have some echo of the same logistical problems that the Russians are having. So I don't think we're going to be seeing assault there. Down here, we have the Kerch Strait Bridge. That's what all the fuss has been about for so long. That is the only rail connection between Russia proper and the entirety of the southern front, including the totality of the Crimean Peninsula. There is a light rail line that goes to the north, but it has been interdicted for the Ukrainians for months, so the Russians wisely have not been using it. So everything needs to go by truck. Now, at the moment, a lot of the truck traffic that used to be on rail is going all the way around the Sea of Azov. Let me bring up a little pointer. This is the Sea of Azov here. And so it's been a long trip that in order to get to northern Crimea, it's about twice to 3 times the distance, costs about 100 times as much in terms of fuel, and ultimately can't transport nearly as much cargo. There are only 3 ways into Crimea. The first one is the Kerch Strait Bridge. The other 2 are here. Now, the one on the eastern side has a bridge, and so expect the Ukrainians to be targeting that shortly. The one on the left, on the west, is a narrow isthmus about 5 miles wide. That's the more stable of the 2, but it is well within the range of Ukrainian middle-range missiles now that the Ukrainians are all the way up on the Dnieper River. So with the fall of Kherson, both are now fully in range. The only other option would be sea shipments. The only good port is Sevastopol, which is right here. But the Ukrainians have already proven, without Kherson, that they can get at ships there with maritime drones and long-range missiles. And so the ships basically are not coming in at all, military, civilian, otherwise. It's basically a dead port. Okay, so where does that leave us? This is all logistical denial. This is all collectively part 1 of what the Russians are going to be suffering from. Part 2 is partisan attacks. You guys may remember that early in the war, the Javelin missiles were all that. In most cases, the Javelins were not targeting tanks, they were targeting trucks. And the Russians lost over 2/3 of their tactical military truck support fleet. Now the Russian military has been, since they're mostly out of trucks, they've been taking city buses and Scooby-Doo vans and putting them into the front to transport troops and gear and fuel and, oh my god, artillery shells. And you don't need javelins to take out civilian vehicles. Like small arms fire works just fine. Now there has been a partisan campaign right here on Melitopol ever since the 2nd month of the war. And that is now the primary supply line for the Russians to get stuff into Crimea, into the southern front. So the most vulnerable vehicles that the Russians have are now what they're completely dependent upon, and they're going through the teeth of the largest partisan resistance of the war just yet. The day after Ukrainian forces entered Kherson, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry released a video of Ukrainian special forces crossing the Dnieper. There does not look like there's going to be all that much of an operational pause. Collectively, this is more than enough to collapse the Russian position even without a regular ground thrust, because this cuts in all food, all supplies in and out of the entirety of the southern front of Crimea. But there is going to be a ground thrust. Okay, so the ground thrust. What we're looking at here is southern Ukraine in all its glory. That orange line is the very approximate line of control. I'm not a graphic artist, sue me. Here are our 3 bridges at Kerch, Novokakova, and Kherson. Now, the Ukrainians will be launching a ground assault, but they're not going to do it from Kherson proper. Not only are the bridges out, but they'd then be facing the same logistic problems that the Russians did in trying to supply across a narrow choke point. They'd also have to deploy into the teeth of Russian forces that are on the south side of the river. That wouldn't be very smart. So instead, what they're going to do is launch from up here in Dnipro. Now, Dnipro is another river city further up, but there are half a dozen bridges that cross the confluence there. That's where the Dnieper and the Samar rivers come together, and the Russians are nowhere to be found. So they can deploy on multiple axes at multiple points and multiple time frames without having to worry about getting shelled because they're at some sort of a bottleneck. And then they can proceed south and attack anywhere in this box. Remember, all the trucks transporting stuff that used to be on a rail line are now being trucked through this box. Now, if I were king for a day and it was up to me where the assault was going to happen, I would probably go after Melitopol, because Melitopol is, well, it's kind of isolated. You see this little indentation from the Sea of Azov? That means it's kind of at the end of a spike, and it's really easy to go after. But Mariupol is a perfectly viable target. Not only is it highly symbolic now since it held out against the Russians for so long, but it is now the primary logistical supply point for all of those many trucks. But wherever they punch south, the point is they've got options now, and they can go wherever the tactical disposition of forces makes sense. And everything to the west of that point is completely cut off. So one of two things is going to happen here. Either the Russians are going to read the map and engage in the most humiliating withdrawal in Russian history, or they're going to stand pat and suffer one of the most humiliating military defeats in Russian history. There is no way out of this chapter of the war that looks good for the Russians.
If the Russians can't bring in food and fuel and troops through those three bridges, well, Crimea's going to have to make its own, and it can't. Sure, the population's about 3 million, but that's not enough to support a large-scale military operation. Crimea has no oil. Crimea has no refineries. They can't bring anything in by ship because the shipping lanes have been interdicted by Ukrainian maritime drones and long-range missiles, so the Russians have no more ships at the port in Sevastopol, and they're not even patrolling the waters off of them. They're basically evacuated completely from the western half of the Black Sea. All that's left is for Crimea to grow its own food. But to do that, they need something called the Crimean Canal, which sources its water from a sluice gate in Kherson province, right across from Nova Kakhovka, which is where the Ukrainian army now is. So that canal is not going to be turned on again come spring, and that means that 80% of the food that Crimea used to produce for itself is now gone, and with Kerch offline, it can't be brought in. So we are looking at a sprawling 1980s style, Ethiopia style famine that is going to utterly destroy any hope the Russians have of having any sort of functional military position anywhere in the peninsula or the southern front. If they don't get out now, they are looking at a catastrophically mind-numbing retreat. But even with all that, it doesn't mean that the war is over. The Russian occupation of the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk suffer from none of these problems. They can be supported directly from the Russian mainland and directly by rail, and Ukraine is going to have to boot them out the old-fashioned way. All this means is we are now at the beginning of the end of what is